everybody. Can you hear me okay? Thumbs up,
yes,
anybody?
All good.
Brilliant. Okay, so welcome everybody to the second of our briefings from the Ryan Institute at the National University of Ireland. These are briefings on COP26. I apologize for the audio quality. We've had a problem with my headset. So thank you all for joining today. We are developing these COP26 briefings essentially to provide an overview twice a week on the developments at COP26. My name is Professor Charlie Spillane. I'm the director of the Ryan Institute at the National University of Ireland in Galway, which is our largest sustainability research institute in the university. We also have at the university a master's program on climate change, agriculture and food security, where we have an excellent group of students each year who are studying at climate change and adaptation and mitigation, particularly in the context of agriculture. So this year, because of the momentous occasion of the COP26 Climate Change Summit, we have asked the students to monitor from the outside, looking in, so to speak, what is happening, the latest developments at COP26. So our students have been, this is the second of our briefings, so a group of the students have been monitoring the developments over the past 2 days. Our previous briefing was on Monday, or on Tuesday, and this is our Thursday briefing. We'll do another next Tuesday and another next Thursday also. So at that, I'd like to hand over to our students who will tell us what they think is going on in COP26, give us an overview in that respect. And then we have a range of guests here from World Vision, from Trócaire, and also we also have World Vision, Trócaire and Christian Aid, that colleagues that are here at COP26 with us, and also Dr. Una Murray, who's here at COP26. So we'll give a range of reflections after the students have given their presentation. And apologies again for the audio quality. Over to you, Isabel.
So hello everyone, my name is Bobby, and I will be part of the group presenting today's presentation for COP, covering the last 2 days, which have been finance and energy. And our talk will be around, is it a new beginning or is it still all talk? Next slide, please. So once again, I want to say thank you to the group that helped put this together. It was a big group of us that helped to research this, and we will be the 3 speakers, myself, Rob, and Kate. And I'm going to pass it over to Rob now, who's going to speak first. Next slide.
Thank you, Bobby. So first of all, I'm just going to talk about reaching net zero emissions by 2050. Scientists at COP26 are seeking net zero emissions, which involve balancing the emissions added and removed from our atmosphere. This is done by removing greenhouse gas emissions and capturing the remaining emissions until they are balanced out. Yesterday, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, which has over 450 financial institutions with assets totaling over 130 trillion US dollars, have provided commitments to reaching net zero over the next 3 decades. The Alliance's members are required to set targets within 12 to 18 months of joining, and more than 90 of the founding institutions have already done so. A key focus of the Alliance is providing finance for developing countries. However, the Alliance has been criticized for allowing financial groups to continue supporting fossil fuel industries in the short term. So net zero must be reached by 2050 to keep the temperature rise within the 1.5 degree thresholds. More than 90 scientists warn that the world is on course for a 3 degrees Celsius temperature increase if action is not taken now. However, there has been some ambitious pledges made at COP26, including India's pledge of net zero emissions by 2070. This is great news, as India is one of the world's leading carbon emitters, and it is good to see that there is an end of burning of fossil fuels in sight by the country. However, the research group Global Climate Action Tracker argues that India's efforts are insufficient, and talking about net zero with no institutional basis for them will mean that India will not deliver. So next slide, please. So the use of clean energy. At COP26 Summit, the delegates have agreed that the burning of fossil fuels, in particular coal, is the single most harmful contributor to climate change, and it needs to stop immediately. Leading scientists say that the elimination of coal burning will help keep temperature rise at about 1.5 degrees Celsius. There are 190 countries and organizations that have agreed at the summit to eliminate coal and prioritize the use of green renewable energy. Global transition to net zero will create 14 million jobs by 2030. And the use of renewable energy is the way forward to tackling climate change. Scientists warn about the risk of burning fossil fuels, as it is already too late to prevent harm, but it is not too late to prevent making it worse. So next slide, please. So now I'm just going to talk about the trends of carbon dioxide emissions. So today at COP was Energy Day, and there was a major focus on using clean energy and phasing out fossil fuels, mainly coal, and creating just energy transitions while leaving nobody behind. So this morning in an event, the Global Carbon Project presented their findings from their annual Global Carbon Budget for 2021. And the findings showed that fossil fuel carbon emissions for 2021 are at about 36.4 gigatons, which is only about 0.8% less than 2019 levels, which was supposed to be the peak year for carbon emissions. There was a decrease of about 5.4% in 2020, but this was down to the COVID pandemic, and the following this year, emissions rose by about 5.4%. Talking about the carbon budget now, we have already emitted 2,475 gigatons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere since 1750. We only have about 420 gigatons of carbon dioxide left in our budget before we reach 1.5 degrees. But however, if we continue with current trends, we will reach this budget within the next 11 years, crossing the 1.5 degrees threshold. However, on a more positive note, the director of the International Energy Agency announced this morning that if countries fulfill their current pledges and their methane pledges, that we are on track to meeting 1.8 degrees warming of 2100, which is a much better figure than what we started off with, which was 2.7 degrees pre-COP. Next slide, please. So in order to keep 1.5 alive, we have to reduce emissions by about 50% by 2030. So another event yesterday from members of the IPCC and climate experts at the WWF Pavilion shared the message of the necessity of 50% reductions for 1.5 degrees, and there is no negotiating with the world's ice. The impact of the melting ice has not been a major discussion point at the COP event, and the damage that is caused by the melting of the cryosphere will last from decades to millennia. The melting of the cryosphere is no longer a warning, it is an urgent call for action, and reaching 50% reductions by 2030 is essential to prevent irreversible damage that will be caused from this. Another challenge from rising temperatures is the melting of the permafrost. The permafrost carbon will come to bite us, as we are told. So even if we keep emission temperature rise below 2 degrees, we're set to see about 1/4 of the permafrost, near surface permafrost, is expected to melt, which is going to release large amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, which will exacerbate the effects of climate change. Countries need to set more ambitious pledges and targets. An example of a country that is setting an excellent target is Scotland. The director of Energy and Climate from Scotland was present at the side event, And she told us that Scotland is on track to reducing emissions by 75% by 2030 and reaching net zero by 2045. They are trying to do this with a just transition from fossil fuels to clean energy, and other countries should follow their example. If we can achieve if all countries can achieve 50% reductions by 2030, we can keep 1.5 alive, and we will be and help nature. That's all from me. And next, I will pass you on to Kate, who is going to talk about financial commitments. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob. So I will look at climate finance commitments. Countries have missed the target of providing $100 billion a year to finance climate mitigation and adaptation by 2020. The question that stands now is, will developed countries stand by new commitments, or will they fail to provide again? So President Cyril Ramaphosa announced South African partnership to push the country away from coal use. The UK, EU, France, Germany, and the US will donate $8.5 billion in the form of grants and loans. 55% of South Africa's energy-related emissions are produced by the coal energy sector. South African President Ramaphosa has announced that the country, under the South African Just Energy Transition Partnership, will aim to move away from coal. To fund more green energy in developing countries, the Global Energy Alliance pooled in $10.5 billion to assist developing economies away from fossil fuel use. Some of the funders included the Bezos Earth Fund, Rockefeller Foundation, and international development banks. The UK will contribute over $100 million in order to access climate finance for developing countries. British politician Rishi Sunak announced that the UK will also provide billions to fund renewable energy in developing countries. The UK will contribute over $100 million to the task force on accessing climate finance for developing countries. The UK will also provide billions to fund renewable energy. And according to the British politician, the UK aims to rewire the entire global financial system for net zero. Sunak also wants the UK to become the financial centre of the world in terms of climate funding. Next slide, please. Next slide again. So in addition, the breakthrough agenda was signed by 40 world leaders with commitments to make clean power, zero emission vehicles, near zero steel, and hydrogen power affordable and accessible by 2030. The Climate Vulnerable Forum signed the Dhaka Glasgow Declaration that stated concerns around the developing world failing to comply with the Paris Agreement. The CBF has called for a delivery plan for the 100 billion over 2020 to 2024, mandating countries to increase commitments at each COP through 2025, and for loss and damages to become a standing item on the COP agenda. Now, Bobby will discuss energy pledges further.
Thank you, Kate. Next slide, please. Okay, hi everyone. So the section I'll be talking about today is revolving around the green zone at COP26. So this mostly will be dealing with NGOs, indigenous groups, and on top of that, I'll look at what activists have been doing and what their response and feeling is towards COP over the last few days. So the first slide we have here is a discussion that was had about insurance companies. So the panel was composed of Peter Boshart, who's the global coordinator of Insure Our Future, and Lucy Pinson, the founder of Reclaim Finance, and Joseph Sikalu, the Pacific managing director of 350.org. So what they discussed at this panel and what their hopes were for insurance companies is that they have the potential to pretty much lead the world in divesting from fossil fuels. So it was stated that insurance industry must be a critical lever for the clean energy transition because as professional risk managers, they have a particular exposure to climate risk. Some of the expectations and hopes of the discussion is that insurers will stop financing fossil fuels and fossil fuel companies unless they align to the 1.5 degree limit and ensure that their clients respect the right of Indigenous people. So to start with, we'll look at some of the positive news of what's happened in this realm of insurance companies. Is that more recently, Australian coal companies have not been able to get insurance anymore, which is a very positive step, as Australia is one of the biggest producers of coal in the world. However, a new scorecard published by Insure Our Future shows that new policies coming from insurers from Korea and Japan are weak in terms of climate goals, but collectively, these new policies are having a significant impact. And on top of this, only a very small cluster of insurance companies exist that still insure coal. However, then things aren't that great when we go look past coal. When you're looking at things like insurers of oil and gas divestment pledges are far weaker than those on coal and tar sands. And companies, insurance companies that are self-proclaimed leaders and founders of the Net Zero Alliance, like Allianz and AXA, are very active in oil and gas underwriters. And at the end of last week, AXA was the first insurer to announce new policy for oil and gas, and it was noted by Insure Our Future to be disappointing, as they can still finance 56% of the planned investments of oil and gas. What you see here on the right is an image from Lucy Pinson and her org Reclaim Finance. They work in creating a scorecard of the world's 30 leading insurers in terms of how they're dealing with fossil fuels. So to compose this, they sent a questionnaire to companies, insurance companies, to fill out, and those that did not reply, they gathered their information from publicly available statistics. So the results show that the leading insurers are not doing better than the rest. In fact, their words are not aligned at all with their actions. So far, 0 insurers excluded oil and gas developers from their investment portfolios, and only 5 insurers votes aligned with the recommendations made by Insure Our Future, and that was only 1 out of 8 climate resolutions evaluated this year. Next slide, please. So now we're going to look at some of the NGOs and Indigenous groups that were represented at COP26 and who came to basically request that their voices are extremely important in terms of climate financing, and that it is really only them that knows the best way to use this financing. So the first image we see here is of Mary Robinson. This was from a conference on mobilizing equitable, just, and gender-sensitive climate finance. So Mary Robinson is the chair of elders and the former president of Ireland. And what she said was we should be asking for finances for rich countries to provide climate finance and to strive to be more ambitious, as the 100 billion required annually has not been met. And developing countries expect to need 5 times more by 2050 to face the challenges of climate change. She also pointed out that only 1/3 of climate finance considers different needs of men and women, which leaves 2/3 of that as gender blind. Another speaker at this was Nancy Tembo. She was the Malawi Minister for Reforestation, and she spoke of the potential of climate finance if invested in women and girls can address population growth and better environmental conservation through education. One positive outcome of this was Kavita Sinha, the Deputy Director for Mitigation and Adaptation of the Climate Green Fund, stating they had committed $10 billion since 2015 and projects that equate to $37 billion in climate finance mechanisms that integrate gender consideration in its operation. The Green Zone also hosted a group of Indigenous people who you'll see in the middle picture. So these are Indigenous people from the Amazon who had come to COP26 to make their voices heard that climate finance and the pledge to stop deforestation cannot succeed without involving the Indigenous people who protect the world's rainforests. Gregorio Mirabal, the General Coordinator of COICA, which is the coordinator of Indigenous organizations of the Amazon River Basin, announced the launch of an initiative to avert the tipping point of the Amazon, or as they refer to it, the Amazonia, which includes biomes such as the water basin and other ecosystems spanning 9 countries, not just the rainforest. They pointed out some devastating facts, such as degradation and deforestation has pushed past the tipping point for 22% of the Amazon already. And most of this happens outside the protected areas of Indigenous territories, which stresses the importance that they play in preserving our rainforests. 66% of the Amazon is subject to some kind of stressors, and warming by 2 degrees is already apparent in some places with increased droughts and fires. But Mirabal stressed that 80% of the rainforest can be protected. 72% of the Amazonia is full of highly biodiverse ecosystems, and the last 8% to be achieved by 2025 just needs to be restored. Unfortunately, 20% of the Amazon is already permanently lost because of things like desertification. They spoke about the issues of funds attributed worldwide are not reaching Indigenous people themselves. Solutions are in the hands of Indigenous people and local people, and without their involvement, any announcement of funding will not be a solution. Orgs like COICA have the mechanism and links to reach the Indigenous people, and they talked about Shandia, which is a New Dawn, and Quechua, which is an Indigenous language of the Amazon. And this initiative is calling for greater financing on the ground and greater access to international funds to better protect local, natural, Indigenous rights, which in extension, the right to protect the Amazon and all other tropical rainforests on the planet. They pointed out that 950 million hectares of tropical rainforests are being protected by COICA and its 4 partner organizations at present. And there was $1.7 billion announced for financing. And the question is how their communities will access that, and that any community managing that financing should have representatives from Indigenous communities and local people. The very bottom picture, we'll see here a discussion of some Inuits from Alaska, Labrador, and Northern Canada. And this discussion focused on Inuit knowledge, innovation, and infrastructure. The point brought up was that the Inuits and Indigenous communities are finding it very difficult to adapt to the changing climate. Ice formation and animal behavior and land erosion are rendering traditional knowledge useless for future generations. And climate finance in these regions needs to be given to build infrastructure like roads and moving communities, as traditional ice sheets were the roads for these people, and their houses were built on raised platforms for insulation. But with the melting of permafrost and ice, their houses are collapsing and roads disappearing. In addition to this, it was pointed out that traditionally, so far, research in the Arctic is traditionally from Western countries, and they will just come, do their research and leave, but they never share what valuable knowledge they acquire with the locals and natives who could use this information to adapt. And as such, they need to be included more in this scientific research. Next slide, please. So now we're going to talk about what activism or what activists have thought about COP26 and what the civil response has been. So climate activists at COP26 are observing from home at COP26 and observing from home have voiced their disappointment at the continuation of business as usual and pointed out the failures of COP26 so far. To date, just until recently, on Tuesday, Extinction Rebellion blocked the entrance to COP26 and held rallies in Glasgow on Wednesday for the apparent greenwashing of the summit. Activists like Alexandria Villaseñor expressed disappointment at the lines, access, and representation issues at COP26. Civil society, she states, is effectively blocked out of the negotiation spaces with no video link or other way to observe the plenaries. Meanwhile, inside the technical negotiation rooms, there are rows of empty seats. There's other issues like poor access for disabilities, and there's been no sign language interpreters apparent in any of the conferences either. And this goes back if you watched the conference with the Indigenous people from the Amazon. They had no interpreter there, so it was up to someone in the audience who could translate to come up and volunteer to do the translation for them. So this leads to other things like there's been reports of climate activists like Aisha Siddiqa of youth activists of color being profiled and removed from 3 events, unlike white activists who have not been removed from the venue for anything. This leads to things like white saviorism is seen to be at play, with activists like Vanessa Nakate being cropped from images by media. You might have seen the image of Greta Thunberg with Nicola Sturgeon, and Vanessa Nakita has been removed in some of those images. There's been issues with the country's pavilions, like the Australian pavilion, for example, seemingly having one sponsor, and that is Santos, which is a fuel company. And Angus Taylor, the Australian Minister for Industry, Energy and Emission Reduction, was supposedly going to make an announcement at the pavilion. But upon hearing that there were activists from the Bushfire Survivor Group in attendance, he decided not to show. Activists think it's inappropriate that there's a large cohort of fossil fuel company representatives in attendance as themselves or part of trade group delegations. To conclude, the whole environment surrounding COP26 has been labeled as exclusionary, racist, ableist, classist, and this environment directly informs the decision-making process. One Guardian article stated that Indigenous people have found incredible barrier to entry, and instead of being facilitated and welcomed in COP and included in negotiations, they've been excluded, and big businesses dominated the discussion and continuing the business as usual mantra. Indigenous people are more visible, but we're not taken any more seriously. We're romanticized and tokenized. It was quoted from Ariel Danger, who is an executive director of Indigenous Climate Action and member of the Facilitated Working Group for North America, which is part of the UN structures established after the Paris Agreement. Indigenous knowledge is being recorded and preserved, but the people with the knowledge are still being excluded from positions of power. More recently, from last night, Animal Rebellion complained that the menu at COP26 makes no effort to promote a plant-based, vegan, or vegetarian lifestyle, with 60% of its dishes containing meat and dairy. It's like one representative from Animal Rebellion is quoted as saying, it's like serving cigarettes at a lung cancer conference. Leaders are not leading by example. The least they could do is not put high carbon meals on the menu. And just to close this off, Greta just a few minutes ago tweeted that COP26 has been named the most excluding COP ever. This is no longer a climate conference. This is Global North Greenwash Festival, a 2-week celebration of business as usual, and blah, blah, blah. Next slide, please. So thank you, everyone, for your attention. It was a pleasure presenting to you today. I hope this was informative. Thank you to Charles and Una and the rest of the write-in.
Thanks very much, Bobby, and I hope everybody can hear me okay. I've had to kind of do a workaround with the audio. So thanks so much to Bobby, to Rob, and to Kate for like an outstanding overview of what's been happening here at COP26 over the past few days. And these briefings are hugely useful for all of us watching, whether we're here in Glasgow or whether we're watching from the outside. Well, so I'll just give you a few kind of my own kind of observations over the past few days. Like one thing that strikes me is that some of the announcements today in relation to the NDC pledges and the NDC pledges and where they will take us to. So basically, the Melbourne University of Melbourne study, the initial analysis of the NDC pledges suggests that the pledges on the table at present would bring us to just below 2 degrees and keep global warming down below 2 degrees. So that would be seen as progress for sure. And in fact, Birol, the head of the International Energy Agency, has also in the last few hours announced in number crunching that the IEA have done, which suggests, as the students have indicated, that the pledges on the table plus the global methane pledge as well, which should keep could keep global warming. I shouldn't say should, but could keep global warming to within 1.8 degrees. But I guess we have to be aware that what we're talking about here are pledges, and those pledges would need to be implemented to reach those targets. So that remains to be seen whether those pledges will actually translate into reality. However, one reflection I have on this is that it does lend some credence to the post-Paris, post-2015 process based on NDCs, where each country can identify what it feels it can do, even if it is insufficient, but at least it's on the table what they intend to do. So these NDCs are intentions, essentially. And that's somewhat, I suppose, enabling for countries. And even though it's running in parallel to a top-down approach where we've got the targets, net zero targets by 2050, or we've got the 1.5 degree target also. So these are things I think we got to consider. So really, the current pledges, while they take us some of the way, they won't take us to 1.5 degrees. And the authors of those reports, whether it's the IEA or whether it's the Melbourne study, have highlighted that we need much deeper emissions cuts up to 2030 if we want to stay within 1.5 degrees or keep 1.5 degrees alive. Indeed, the Global Carbon Project that has come out as well in their analysis in the past few days indicates that fossil fuel emissions have really rebounded to pre-pandemic levels, that emissions from coal and gas are jumping this year back to where they were in 2020. So, one wonders, are we losing the opportunity, hopefully turning the tide on the COVID pandemic to transition to a greener future rather than a kind of back to fossil fuel as usual normality, essentially. And Kwasi Kwarteng, the UK Business Secretary, in the last few hours has said that the global transition to clean energy needs to go at roughly 5 times the pace that it is going at present. So while we have the pledges, you know, whether they translate into reality is a major question. Other things I think that are notable in the past 2 days is that we've got 40 countries who've agreed to phase out coal-fired power. And that's really great to see Canada, Poland, countries Ukraine, Indonesia, Vietnam, and others. However, like missing from that, we've got Australia, China, India, and the US from that pledge in terms of phasing out coal-fired power. You know, this is against the backdrop of the IEA indicating that all new developments of fossil fuels must cease this year if the world is to stay within the 1.5 degrees limit. Then we also have in parallel to that a related question of like ending finance for overseas fossil fuel development. And again, we have 20 countries and an investment institutions such as the European Investment Bank agreeing to stop all finance for overseas fossil fuel development, which is a welcome development. But again, China, Japan, and Russia, you know, haven't signed up to that. Then if we look at the negotiations themselves, what's happening there are many parallel negotiations going on here, discussions on climate finance. You know, it may seem strange to people, I think, that there are still discussions on the definition of climate finance. And, you know, is the climate finance going to be new and additional financing over and beyond existing financing for overseas development aid, for instance? And then some of the countries and blocs are indicating that they have difficulties, high transaction costs in accessing existing climate finance, such as the Global Climate Facility. So then if we look at the NDCs, there are discussions underway on the NDCs around common formats for NDCs. Like within the master's program in NUI Galway, we've done a lot of analysis, the students have, of intercomparability between NDCs and INDCs, and they're all different. They're all different formats. It's impossible. It's really largely difficult, very difficult to compare between NDCs. So the countries are discussing on whether those formats should be tabular or narrative formats, and there's similar discussions underway about national inventory reports. And in relation to Article 6.2, we've got discussions, a lot of disagreements between the countries on many aspects in relation to Article 6, and particularly in Article 6.2, which is about internationally transferred mitigation options, which is really to bring in a new international carbon trading system. And there's many divergent views between countries on that topic. Similarly, there are discussions on national adaptation plans and also on a fourth review of the adaptation fund. So on the agriculture side, which is germane to our master's program in NUI Galway, you know, there are differences happening between the developed and developing countries as to whether mitigation should be considered in the frame of agriculture in addition to adaptation. You know, and that's really important, the adaptation side of things, because, you know, while a lot of focus is on the mitigation side of things, the United Nations Environment Program said on Thursday that we really need to have a much greater, as I said today, essentially, we must have a greater focus on adaptation. And if anybody wants to kind of look at the imperative on that, they can look at the UNEP Adaptation Gap Report 2021. So these are just some of my own kind of reflections in relation to this. And at that, I'd like to hand you over to Una Murray, and then we'll come back to some of the panelists that we've invited in from the COP meeting here. Okay, so thank you. Over to you, Isabel, and on to Una. Yeah.
Hi, everybody. I hope you can hear me. Okay. Thanks very much for all of the students who did the presentation today and the 3 who presented. It was really, really good and very good to get your reflections. So I suppose I focused a lot, I'm going to focus a lot on adaptation and displacement. And they're the kind of events that I've been attending in the last couple of days. And as you already know, I mean, climate-related disasters are already forcing millions of people to flee. I think in 2020, hazardous weather events triggered about 30 million displacements. And, you know, figures, some of the predictions are 360 million people will be displaced within their countries. Well, some may move across borders, but generally people move within their countries first. And it's a major problem, and it's happening now. So it kind of links a lot with adaptation and what was being said earlier about loss and damage, and the fact that finance is focused on mitigation rather than adaptation. So one of the events, I mean, I'm just going to pick out 3 events that stood out for me. One of the events that I went to was I'm not going to pronounce this correctly, the Raoul Wallenberg Institute, RWI, who talked with the Nordic Refugee Council, and they had a very strong focus focus on looking at human rights and national adaptation plans, or adaptation in general. And there was, presentations from human rights legal perspective on how climate and human rights are linked together. That was from Wisconsin University Law School. And some examples were given of, how already people are facing loss and damage from climate change. It struck me, there was a video of a Cambodian fisherman on the Tonle Sap river, and a hydro dam had been built, and before it would take an hour to reach the fish, now it takes 2 to 3 hours to go where he needs to go. And some of the issues he and his family are facing is, they've no money, food security, their daughters had to migrate to cities to send money to keep them going, they had to borrow money, etc., etc. So what can be done now about those type of people was the question. And an analysis was done on adaptation plans. And the ones that we looked at in class, we looked at, I think we said there was 22 or 23 NAPs, as they're called, already on the site. An analysis was done to look at whether human rights feature strongly in these adaptation plans. And they were looking for words such as, right to water, justice, food security, education, health, direct references to human rights as well as indirect references. And the result of that will be some sort of guidelines on human rights incorporation into adaptation. So I found that very interesting. Kind of a big event that I went to was to try and understand the what's called the Warsaw International Mechanism, which is supposed to be, it's for loss and damage associated with climate change. And it was established in, I think, at COP13 in 2013 to address loss and damage associated with the impacts of climate change. And then under the Paris Agreement, it became the main vehicle to avert, minimize, and address loss and damage associated with climate change impacts. And it's called the WIM, the Warsaw International Mechanism, and it has kind of 3 areas. It provides knowledge and understanding of the risks. It has dialogue among different parties and stakeholders outside the national parties, and also it's trying to encourage finance, technology, and capacity building. So what I found interesting about it was that there's 5 expert groups that presented today, and a big one is the Task Force on Displacement, but also an expert group on slow onset events and non-economic losses, action and support, and risk management. So the non-economic losses was interesting in terms of what was said earlier about Indigenous people, and there was actually 2 different Indigenous people presented on that, and how, you can't quantify the loss when you're displaced, when a culture is lost, as well as livelihoods and all those sort of other aspects. And there was people there from Bhutan as well, talking about the fact that their country did very little in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, but they're already experiencing effects from ice cap melting and water and floods, and so on. So that was a very interesting side event on loss and damage, and something that I would like to follow up more on. And then one last event that I'd like to mention was run by the Bangladesh delegation, again on loss and damage. And the Red Cross and the University of Dhaka had done analysis of displaced people in Bangladesh. The discussion centered around how do you define loss and damage. Try not to think of it as disaster displacement. It's not disaster displacement. It's not adaptation. It's like there's a difference between forced displacement, migration. So how do you quantify it, and how does finance go to it, and some of the mechanisms for finance? So that was really good. And actually Bangladesh was hailed as being one of the first countries, I think, who now has a national strategy on internal displacement management, which is actually human rights based approach. So I'll just show it to you here. And that was also very interesting to see. So basically my focus in the last couple of days has really been on displacement, adaptation, loss and damage, and you know, is that, can finance go to that as well? Arguments about how finance can go towards that area, as well as how do you quantify it, which is not too easy. Over. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Una, for a really good overview of what you've been following over the past few days. And so at that, I'm gonna pass over to some of our invited panelists who Una and I have kind of been talking to here in Glasgow. So firstly, I'd like to try to invite Siobhan Curran from Trócaire. Siobhan, do you want to give us a few reflections on how you find the process going so far, and any highlights or challenges that you've seen in relation to particularly the past few days? Over to you, Siobhan.
Yes, no, thank you so much. And thank you for the presentation from the students. It's excellent. I'd love if you were here with us at the negotiations. You've covered such a multitude of issues and really insightfully, so thanks for that. Yeah, I mean, some thoughts, I suppose from the outset, Trócaire are here and we work on climate justice from the perspective of the communities who are worst affected by climate impacts and who are facing the worst impacts right now as we speak. So our perspective at the COP is really trying to look at how things are progressing from the climate justice angle and ensuring that any climate action is based on human rights and equality and is equitable. And so some thoughts of the last few days, I think you picked up on a lot of them in the presentations. I mean, one was around participation. You know, it just has been the biggest issue that's coming again and again, that people are talking about the lack of access to certain spaces, the plenaries. It has been quite inaccessible at times, and that's against the backdrop of, you know, there were already issues around participation before this COP. There's a lot of people who just didn't even make it here because of vaccine inequity, because of visa issues, because of the cost. So you have now accessibility while we're here, compounding the fact that some people are not even here. So I think that's a huge issue, and it really needs to be addressed, because if the voices of people most affected are excluded from the negotiations, they just, apart from anything, they won't be successful and they won't bring us to where we need to be. And people affected by issues will first of all have the right, but are crucial to making informed, effective decisions. And another thought, I suppose, is around the climate finance. So I suppose there was a lot of focus on the Glasgow Financial Alliance for net zero, and the kind of the statement that they could deliver 100 trillion of financing, which is, you know, quite significant when you think of the 1 billion that's been promised and hasn't been delivered. I suppose a thought on that is, there is a question about whether the institutions who've benefited from the current system are going to be the new champions in the future. And I think that needs to be interrogated. Certainly from Trócaire's perspective, we work on corporate accountability, and at a minimum, we think there should be legally binding regulations for corporations with respect to human rights and the environment. And it's very much linked to this, given that last year, 4 land and environmental defenders were murdered per week for defending their communities, their environment and their land. So these are very interlinked issues, and I think need corporate accountability, I think needs to be a much bigger theme, or a theme at COP as well. On the 1 billion, I think there have been pledges to bring us closer to the 1 billion that was promised by developed countries to developing countries. I think there's still an issue around the assurance that 1 billion will actually be met and will be delivered. And of course, we know that 1 billion is, you know, it needs to be scaled up significantly to meet the actual needs. So that would be crucial, that there's progression around a collective target for climate financing. You know, I think a very strong message came out for me from I was at the Cannes Climate Action Network press briefing this morning, and they were saying the 1 billion target was developed by richer countries. So the new target needs to be developed by the countries affected, and it needs to be based on equity, historical responsibility and solidarity. It's all around the decision making changing as well. Just on loss and damage, I mean, it was at the plenary, the speech by the Barbados Prime Minister, Mia Moore-Motley, was so powerful, and she talked about loss and damage being felt in, you know, in the loss of lives and communities. She said it much better than I'm saying it now. She's so powerful, and you know, she was talking about how moral and how unjust it is, and so it was interesting to hear at the Climate Vulnerable Forum that the feeling from the developing countries that it was still being a challenge to get loss and damage as a formal item on the agenda. So that'll be important to see, and I know the focus on that will be next week. And I think it'll be key that there is an agreement on the separate financing stream, as you mentioned there, Una, as well, but also you know, how it's going to be delivered and when. So those kind of thorny issues need to be grappled with. And maybe I'll finish up to, I suppose the other thing that was interesting is the fossil of the day is a nice award that can give to those who are dragging their feet the most on a particular day. And so yesterday that went to the US for the Aim for Climate initiative, which I think, yeah, given your course, you probably find really interesting, because it's really felt that this initiative is supporting agribusiness. It's undermining sustainable agriculture and transformative approaches, which are exactly what we need to tackle climate change. And that is something that Ireland have signed up to also. So I suppose, yeah, maybe to conclude, you know, that might have sounded negative, but I think there's a lot of progress, perhaps, you know, being forged out at negotiations. I suppose it's very early days, but we'll be really looking at the end of the COP from that perspective of equity and social justice, and really, yeah, that there's progression around climate action, but it's done in a way that's fair. So I'll finish up there.
Thanks so much, Siobhan. That's really wonderful, and I guess you're highlighting the kind of the undercurrent of kind of social exclusion that is running along with this COP in parallel, which the students have raised and you've also highlighted. So I'm going to move to our next panelist, which is Maurice Sadlier from World Vision. So Maurice, can you connect with us there, and you can give us your reflections on how you feel that things are going here in Glasgow?
Thanks very much, Charles. And it's hard not to repeat much of what Siobhan has said, and indeed what the students have said, because I think they have a better understanding of what's actually happening in the building than I do, to be honest, because it's a really comprehensive approach. But I think there's a few interesting things that pop out at me. And again, like Siobhan, I don't want to come across as sounding negative, because I think there is progress being made. And I think, to be honest, if we look next week, this will probably be spun somewhat as a positive COP because of the new sort of commitments and pledges we've seen. However, I've just come from an event where Selwyn Hart, the Undersecretary General for Climate Action, was talking, and he pushed back slightly on the IEA's figure of 1.8 and said the NDCs still put us to 2.7 degrees, and kind of noted their pledges, and that's what they are, and that there is still a lot of work to be done. And I think if we look at ourselves, and I haven't looked at the Climate Action Plan this afternoon, but these figures include the pledges of the 100 countries towards the methane reduction that was taken, that our own country committed to on Tuesday, but which, according to the Irish Times this morning, were bypassed in the Climate Action Plan that came out this afternoon. So if every country starts doing a little slight fudge, then the pledges are meaningless, and we're not going to get anywhere. I had an interesting discussion with a woman called Agnes Lena, she's from Kenya. She runs an organization called Ila Matarak, and she looks at this 1.7 billion of funding for Indigenous land rights and is really appreciative of it and really welcomes it, but is going, as a small NGO in Kenya, how does she access those funds? how are those funds flowing to the local community levels? And I think that will come a lot of what happens here at COP is what does that actually mean for the communities that Siobhan and Conor and I look at, or the communities in Ireland, and how is this impacting and how does it operationalized in plans? And indeed, how does it impact the climate action plan? And we're here with two young people from Galway who are trying to engage with Galway City Council. Fairly slowly, the council are trying to engage. So how do we hold government to account at home for what they're committing to here? And how do we engage in the process? And I think there's really important discussions happening, but and this is no surprise from World Vision, young people are completely excluded. And what I'm being asked a lot is, oh, are your young people going to the march tomorrow? Are they going to the march on Saturday? Why should it not be, why are young people not included in the negotiations? Why are they not part of the discussions? There's discussions happening here about action for climate empowerment, how young people are engaged in climate action. Is there any children or young people in that room? No. Are they being asked in these negotiations? No. So I think the process and the way we work has to change as well. I think it shouldn't be, and we've had these discussions before, it shouldn't be young people outside shouting to be involved. Negotiators and governments need to be reaching out to figure out how to bring in young people and children more into the discussions. I think there's, to quote Selwyn Hart again, he made a really interesting discussion back to the finance today around multilateral development banks and basically called them out and said they're not doing enough for climate action. And he was quite strong on that, and he was kind of asking them to do more. So I think we're seeing good commitments being made and good pledges being made, but I think it's how those will be delivered. I think it's really hard to see the climate negotiations. And I find it interesting that this is one of the most publicized COPs I've seen, and there's so much media interest in it. And I think if people actually kind of looked at what the decisions that will be adopted next week, aside from the pledges, which are not COP decisions, so the actual decisions that are taken by the parties next week, they're probably quite dull and boring, many of them, and people would be like, what is that about? But that's where the success lies, and that's in the rules, and that's how we will implement it. And I think it's important that we try and keep an eye on those as well. And that comes back to Siobhan's point of being excluded from the negotiations and observers not being able to do their job properly, of observing what's happening and making sure people are held to account. But I'll keep quiet now to let someone else have a talk.
Maurice, thanks so much, and there's some really excellent perspectives, and it's really great that you've brought up the question of intergenerational inequity, which is at the heart of the whole climate change question and the negotiations. So that sort of at that, I'll move on to our last panelist, which is Conor OReilly from Christian Aid, and Conor's going to give us his thoughts on how he feels things are going here and any insights he has into the process and where it might be going.
Thanks, Charlie.
Okay, Conor?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, so it's Conor OReilly is my name, from Christian Aid Ireland, and much like some of the topics that Una mentioned and my colleagues Maurice and Siobhan as well, we're coming here with the perspective of a development organization and really trying to make sure that the global justice aspect of all of this isn't forgotten in the middle of the negotiations. A big focus for us really has been the issue of finance and this question of support from the wealthy, high-emitting states who have really caused the crisis, and the vulnerable communities that we work with in some of the poorest countries in the world who are already bearing the disproportionate impacts of the crisis. And to be honest, I've spent a lot of time talking with delegates from developing countries, particularly African delegates, and there is a real kind of palpable sense of anger. And I think it was really strongly represented in the leaders' speeches in the first few days at the failure of wealthier states to live up to the promises they've been made. The kind of fabled $100 billion per year figure that was made in Copenhagen back in 2009, 12 years ago, and we've still fallen well short of it. And that is really setting the context for this COP. We think, we think the success of it is really going to hinge on this question of finance more so than any other COP before it. I think I totally concur with a lot of the assessment that Siobhan set out, but maybe some of the other points that I'd encourage students to have a look out for over the next couple of weeks as well, particularly on this finance question. There are two things that stand out. The first one is the idea of in what form is this money being given? So there's been a lot of debate so far about whether finance is being delivered as grants, which is untied money that doesn't have to be repaid, much like existing ODA flows, or as loans, which have to be repaid, often at interest. They can add to unsustainable debt burdens for the developing countries. And really those loans, they fail to address the sort of historical imbalance and inequities that make these transfers of money necessary in the first place. So that's a big issue here of how the money will be provided. Are countries going to be tied up in conditional loans, or is it going to be delivered through grants, which is really important. And secondly is the adaptation and mitigation split. And I think every speaker mentioned the importance of adaptation a little bit, and that's something that's been lost so far. If you look at most assessments of climate finance to date, estimates are that only about 20% of it has gone to adaptation. And that's a real problem, because again, we're from a global justice perspective, a big part of this is making sure that communities who are vulnerable to climate change, who are feeling the effects already, are able to adapt and are protected. One of the things, maybe another observation for me over the past few days that links into this, is the role of the private sector, hedge funds, banks, and so on, in trying to meet the shortfall in current financial targets. And we would be very concerned to have listened to the heartfelt pleas of developing nations made so far, but then a very strong response from wealthier countries. And it seems as if there is a hope that the private sector will mobilize huge amounts of money to try and plug in the gap. We'd be really concerned about the equity of that. For example, one of the reasons that so much money has gone into mitigation so far and not into adaptation is that it's easier to convince private investors to put money into something like a new energy plant to move away from coal and work on mitigation. But it's much harder to deliver a return on investment on, building a seawall, for example. So we're really trying to emphasize the importance of grant-based support, focus on adaptation, which, to their credit, is something that Ireland has done exceptionally well. And we're trying to encourage the Irish negotiators here to really lead by example and push the EU bloc to focus on that and to not to go down that road of private finance. I was at the launch today of the UNEP adaptation gap report that was mentioned already. And there's been some talk, whispers among negotiators, that there's a push to try and double the amount of finance that's going towards adaptation. That's something that's really important. And again, the devil will be in the detail there, but that's somewhat encouraging, despite the fact that I would share the concerns of a lot of the other speakers. And one other thing, maybe just a reflection on what was said so far. I think it was Rob that talked about the NDCs that have been submitted by each country, that their individual plans to get their emissions down, and what do the changes over the last few days, particularly India's new pledge, mean. And it's promising that you're seeing it potentially starting to dip below that 2-degree threshold. But I suppose a word of caution would be that even 1.8 or 1.7 degrees of warming is going to have an enormous and negative impact on people all over the world. And we have to kind of not succumb to this sort of political bargaining where 2 is the worst case scenario, 1.5 is brilliant. And sure, if we land somewhere in the middle, won't that be good progress? Every single emission counts, every single fraction of a degree counts. So we really need to keep pushing the figure down. And finally, on that same point, a lot of those NDCs that have been submitted, those plans, particularly by developing countries, are conditional on finance. So when you look through the detail, you have developing countries saying, okay, we're going to do A, B, and C, but only if the funds that have been pledged are provided. So you can't really decouple anything in this COP. The NDCs that are going to get the emissions down, that are going to keep us below that 1.5 degree threshold, they're intimately linked and dependent on these other questions of finance and support for both mitigation and adaptation that we're working on. And that's something that's extremely important. So hopefully we'll see some movement on that in the next 10 days. But I think if we come out of this COP without real, strong conclusions on financial support, it'll be a missed opportunity. The last note I'd say is I was speaking with a colleague earlier in the week, and he mentioned that, this issue of climate finance, it's not some sort of charitable extra. It's the repayment of an ecological debt, really. by the wealthy high emitting states who caused the crisis. And yeah, movement on that really is our #1 metric to assess success at this COP. So maybe we can check back in again in 10 or 11 days time and see how those states have done.
Super. Thanks so much, Conor. So I think that's been really good that you've helped to kind of unpack, I guess, you know, the questions around the NDCs and also the conditionalities associated with them. Like, I suppose, as a kind of wrap up, one thing that strikes me is that, you know, while the NDCs and the modeling of, you know, where they will take us to are welcome, yeah, that's for sure. I think there is a danger that pledges might be misinterpreted for actions amongst the general society, and there's a possibility of complacency setting in that, you know, the 2030 targets are what we got to aim for, or net zero by 2050. But really, the climate leading countries of the future will be those that will get there faster and quicker, and they will have the economies of the future. So in that sense, you know, at its core, the Paris Agreement has this question of ambition, and one can question, you know, whether, like, which countries have the most ambition, and will they be really the kind of leading, you know, climate friendly countries of the future. And then the other thing that strikes me is on the adaptation side. So as Conor indicated, most of the financing currently goes to mitigation activities, with very little on the adaptation side. And adaptation is critically important to those that are the most vulnerable and those that have historically contributed the least to the emissions situation that we're in. So redressing that balance of financing between mitigation and also adaptation is critical to the future of these negotiations. So I think, you know, the adaptation goal, is that going to be kicked down the road to the next COP? It was certainly a priority for the African group of countries. Is it a priority for the OECD countries and so forth? That remains to be seen. So I think, you know, these briefings are quite useful, I think, to all of us to kind of, as a means of crowdsourcing our reflections and our investigations of what's happening here at COP. And I think, you know, Bobby, Rob, and Kate have done like an outstanding job in analysing what has been going on for the past 2 days, and we've been able to kind of not counter that, but to kind of complement that, I think, from the contributions of Una, Morris, Conor, and Siobhan. And so in that sense, you know, I'd like to thank everybody, and we're going to do another one of these briefings at 5 o'clock next Tuesday, and then on the following Thursday again at 5 o'clock. So if you want to tune in, we'll broadcast all of these on YouTube. These are being broadcast at present. If anybody wants to tune in or pass them on to any colleagues you think these would be useful to, we'll keep doing these briefings until the end of COP, and we'll see where it takes us. And so we're currently nearly at the end of week 1. So this is where we are. Let's see where we are next Tuesday. So thanks again, everybody, and let's see how things go.